You are listening to Savage Bites, Episode 23, Hooked. Let me open this account with a stark warning. While you listen to this broadcast, a viral app is insinuating itself all across the internet, covertly installing itself on every machine and device with a live net connection. The app is called Hooked. It may already be installed on your devices. After this announcement is complete, disconnect from the internet, extract the hard drive from your PC, Mac or laptop, and destroy it with a hammer. Destroy your smartphone. Destroy any and all smart devices in your possession. Avoid electronics at all costs. Failure to comply with this directive may lead to premature death. Xander Jones was smart. Very smart indeed. Smart enough to get the best exam results in the whole country back in 2019. The year he sat his A-levels. Most people are only allowed to study 3 or 4 subjects at that stage of their academic career. Xander was one of the few exceptions. He took 14 subjects and aced it across the board, achieving the highest honours in each and every one of them, with a passing grade of A star. We were friends at school, best friends for a time. In my younger years, I was as introverted as he was, even more so perhaps, and his camaraderie brought me out of myself. His vitality and zest for knowledge and experiment, qualities that remained hidden from the world behind a facade of shyness, were shared with me, and through them, and through his enthusiastic encouragement of my artistic and other creative pursuits, my eyes were opened to my own latent potential. As the years wore on, I was reduced to the status of an associate, merely a dim and distant satellite to the iridescent star he was to become, though I never forgot those lessons he taught me. Xander didn't really do friends in the years after school. By that time, he was just on another level from the rest of us. If you did run into him, you always got the impression he was humouring you, like an adult talking to a babbling infant. He wasn't deliberately condescending, nothing intentionally unkind, but you could tell he was modulating the level of his conversation, artificially holding it down to a level you could understand. That must have been an effort for him. I think that was part of the reason he became so reclusive. It just cost him too much energy to interact with the parochial savages around him. At 15, he wrote a piece of medical software, something to do with real-time heart rate monitoring and management, for one or other of the big pharma tech companies. I forget which one. The technology he authored found its way onto ICU wards worldwide, and had a revolutionary impact on post-trauma patient survivability. He saved, literally thousands of lives. I think it's important to bear that in mind, in light of what happened later. I think to do him justice, you need to understand that he wasn't a bad guy. The accumulation of money was never an objective for Xander Jones, though he'd already amassed a sizable fortune before his peers had graduated university. He was at the bleeding edge of a new breed of creatives, an elite class of visionary engineers who began to emerge after the millennium. Theirs was a new renaissance, straddling art and science in the tradition of Leonardo da Vinci, though their medium was digital, computational, audiovisual, wholly immersed in virtual worlds where physical limitations had been superseded, where the only boundaries were those of imagination. Social media had entranced billions, its meteoric rise captivating a generation, shifting the focus of social interaction and interactive entertainment from the real world into the digital space in an unprecedented way. Xander and his peers took the lessons of those pioneers and their initial forays, extrapolating them exponentially, creating totally immersive virtual realities that in many cases subsumed the lives of their early adopters, worlds that were to blur the borders of reality itself as the 21st century unfolded. By the age of 20, Xander had become a virtual recluse, in the most literal sense, living virtually, and almost exclusively online, absorbed in what he described to those few favoured individuals who could still count themselves among his circle as his research. I'd heard from a business associate that Xander had acquired at auction the shuttered Gothic church in South London, where he had taken up residence. It seemed, I thought, appropriate to his needs and suitably symbolic of his hermetic lifestyle. He'd had it hastily restored, so the story ran, and fitted out to his own specification, installing at great expense all the equipment necessary to the unfettered pursuit of his all-consuming passion. Cloistered there alone, he had, once the last of the workmen had departed, admitted no visitors, focusing his whole attention on his work. Having finally freed himself from all external interference, he had bent his will and formidable talents to a singular, and for the time being, very secret task. Xander had been working for 22 hours straight. In his teens, he could pull a 40-hour shift on coke and candy bars. Now, at 23, he found that in order to retain the laser focus required for his work, he must lean more and more heavily on dexedrine and the other bespoke compounds supplied to him via diplomatic packet. Anything is possible when you have money and connections, from his Bangkok pharmacist. He coded at a blistering pace, far faster than the average person can read. His fingers a blur, the staccato clackety-clack of his mechanical keyboard as relentless as monsoon rain. Lines of code spewed from the flashing cursor like so much spilt ink, spreading spider trails that filled up the 8K screen before him as it scrolled steadily in an endless stream of consciousness intersecting mind and brain and machine. He sat in a high-backed leather chair in an elevated position at the chancel end of the church. The vast walnut partner's desk before him, which had once graced Newton's laboratory at Cambridge, faced the apse, where a sheer bank of monitors stood in place of the crucifix, above which towered the 14th century stained glass pictorial of the Archangel Raphael. Behind him stretched the immense nave, its vaulted ceiling lost in the gloom 80 feet above the flagstone floor. The ordered ranks of wooden pews that had graced that hallowed hall for 3 centuries had gone. Now a brute block of servers dominated that central space, clothed in a veil of dry vapour given off by the cooling system. It hummed and glittered with a million LED lights that flashed and flickered. It looked for all the world like some towering dystopian city crafted in miniature. Working frantically at the keyboard, the sight of the young engineer might have called to mind the vision of some insane church organist, the theatrical caricature of one lost in a silent symphony, whose exhilarating passages were extant only within the confines of his own troubled mind. Tapping out a loose handful of little white pills into his palm, he tossed them into his mouth, wincing at their bitter aridity, before washing them down with the remaining contents of a neon-bright soda can. He stretched his spindly arms aloft, interlacing his fingers, cracking his knuckles absent-mindedly, before returning to the task at hand, invigorated by the stimulant, and zealous in the knowledge that its completion was almost in his grasp. A few fleeting hours later, he was done, and he reclined in his chair to admire his creation. To the uninitiated eye, it was a complex mass of code, as unintelligible as the ancient hieroglyphics that comprised much of its abstruse symbolism. To Xander, it was beautiful. Its graceful form balanced and agile, its infinite functionality revealed all at once in pin-sharp clarity. There was no need to test it. His work was flawless. Of that he was absolutely certain. Mistakes had a way of revealing themselves to Xander in a way wholly opaque to others. They stood out in sharp relief, illuminated specks of blight seen against the clear, pristine code around them. All he saw before him was perfection. This was his most elegant, his most rigorously lean, his most muscular work to date. It would bridge the gap between mind and machine, interfacing directly with the subject for the first time in seamless symbiosis. This was a seminal work, his magnum opus. It called, of course, for his traditional celebration, and he snatched his phone from the desk to make the call.
1 extra large triple pepperoni hot, garlic mayo, and a bottle of Pepsi Max. Going to St. Justice Church in West Dulwich, at the top of the grove on the hill. You know the place, huh?
Peter nodded curtly, grunting in acknowledgement. Lips tight, jaw set in that wolfish scowl he perpetually wore, his pale eyes fixed on the brawny, bearded Farouk, as he slid the pizza box across the counter. Farouk regarded him leerily through dark, half-lidded eyes.
You got 15 minutes. Come right back. It's going to be a busy night.
Peter straddled the moped, spurring it to life with a press of a button, its little motor snarling and rattling at tick-over like a nicotine-addicted wildcat. Its uneven snarl rising to a hysteric scream as he wound up the throttle and fired the bike into the dense crawl of Brixton traffic. It was just after 10 p.m. Peter had grown up on the verdant plains of western Poland, on the family farm just outside Luban, just a few miles from the German border. The frenetic melting pot of London had proved something of a culture shock to the young Pole when he arrived 2 years ago, and for a time he'd longed for home. Now he was part of it, or at least he was inured to it, hardened by experience against its grim pleasures and its subterranean excesses. He was a cork, bobbing and buffeted on the surface of that conflux of cultures, that taut deadlock of creeds wrestling cheek by jowl. Just another prophet predator, hunting the convoluted canyons of an urban reef carved in concrete and neon. Peter filtered the moped through a shoal of gleaming cars to the head of the queue, cutting out into the streaming traffic, slipping a narrow gap between two slow-moving leviathans, and traversing the roundabout with practiced ease, the little motor howling beneath him, the piquant tang of unleaded, underscored by the gruff stench of diesel fumes in his irritated nostrils. He thought of his father, far away on the farm, where he'd grown to manhood, perched on the old bench in the yard, sipping home-brewed beer in the twilight, oblivious by long acquaintance to the simple joy of the clear, sweet, wholesome country air. The Church of St. Justice towered at the top of the hill, its dark, monolithic bulk looming over the surrounding streets and houses, like a shepherd standing guard over his sleeping flock. The wrought iron gates were ajar, and Peter's moped cut across the pavement, slipping the gap without breaking pace. He brought the little bike skidding to an abrupt halt at the foot of the steps that led up to the main door. The place was in darkness, save for the flickering violet glow of video screens that bled out into the London night from the high lancet windows. There was muted music too, emanating from within, a slow, broken backbeat decorated with a languid arrangement of exultant chords. Peter sniffed in derision, paradoxically condemning the excesses of the wealthy London urbanite, whilst at the same time secretly coveting the very extravagances he overtly derided. He rapped on the heavy door with hard knuckles. Receiving no answer, he knocked again, this time more firmly, and at that the door swung inward an inch. The door was open, unlocked, just pushed against the frame. The winding passage of music continued, somewhat louder now, with the partial opening of the door. The pizza was getting cold, and he needed to get back. He didn't want to piss off Farouk by being late. Not again. As uninspiring as it was, he needed this job. The money wasn't bad, and the freewheeling excitement provided by those hectic excursions on the bike more than made up for the mundanity of the job itself. He slid in through the door, calling loudly, his English hard-edged with a thick Eastern European lilt, addressing the church's hidden occupant, but again he received no reply. A bank of screens dimly illuminated the cavernous space from the farther end, where a tiny figure sat in a high-backed chair, his diminutive form silhouetted in black against the blue glow of dancing images forming and colliding on the giant screen. That must be my customer, he thought, annoyed now at the man's ignorance. It was obvious, he thought, that the guy wouldn't be able to hear him at the door with all this going on, but perhaps that was why the door had been left open. Peter advanced towards the chancel, determined to complete his delivery. In the back of his mind he was hoping for, if not expecting, a decent tip. This guy clearly had money, lots of money. And these upper-middle-class beneficiaries of the tech explosion often felt an abstract yet keen sense of guilt when it came to their own successes, and were inclined to assuage that guilt by way of exorbitant tips, a habit that Peter was all too happy to indulge. The music washed over him as he advanced, its cultured complexity working on his mind. It certainly was strangely alluring, and he hardly noticed as his steps slid subconsciously into rhythm with the beat. He felt a swelling sense of elation, an unconscious euphoria building within him as he listened. On the screen, strange figures moved and danced, spinning, forming and dissipating, reforming, evolving, a concerto of colour and light, flickering in complex syncopating rhythms that precisely matched and complemented the convoluted progressions of its hypnotic refrain. Halting beside the high-backed chair, but ignoring its occupant, Peter paused. He felt light-headed, weightless and oddly ecstatic, the pizza forgotten in his numbed hands. He gazed at the screen in rapt fascination. Adrift in an undulating soundscape of ambient sideshell, his mind slipping away, lost in the boundless hinterlands of hypnagogic hallucination. I hadn't seen Xander for well over 2 years. I'd never been to his new place, not until that night, the night I was contacted by MI5. I'd caught the tail end of something on the news earlier in the day, a scant story about an incident in South London. I, like many others, had paid it little heed, assuming it was simply another in the seemingly endless thread of terror attacks that had intermittently plagued the capital since the millennium. Such incidents were all too commonplace, and had become almost routine. I was to discover at first hand that this time the circumstances were different. Very different, yet no less destructive, no less abhorrent to the normal citizenry of the city, no less injurious to the collective psyche and to the sanctity of human life. They contacted me on the Friday night. It had been a long week, and I was on my way home after a grueling day at the office when I got the call. How they got my number, and why they chose me, I didn't know, but later learned that I was considered his oldest and perhaps closest friend, and I suppose they felt that an old familiar face might make a difference. Of course, at that point, they really had no idea what we were up against. By the time I got home, they were waiting for me, 2 unmarked black BMWs idling at the curb, an agent standing at my doorstep, conversing with my wife in hushed tones.
"Ah, hello, you must be Seth. Seth Bellamy, correct?"
He held out his hand with a taut smile at my approach.
"I'm Captain Kane, MI5.
I shook the proffered hand, gazing in puzzlement at my wife in the doorway. He went on to address my wife, all business.
"Mrs. Bellamy,
I'm afraid I must recruit the aid of your husband for the remainder of the evening. I do hope you don't mind." His smile was sincere, but it was obvious that his request was a mere formality, and it was evident that neither of us really had much choice in the matter. Kate nodded, deferentially, kissing me lightly on the cheek and taking my briefcase. Then I was led away by the elbow. I climbed into the back seat of the second car, and the door was shut behind me, and I caught a fleeting glimpse of Kate, looking fraught with worry on the doorstep of our little house in Chiswick, as I was swept away into the neon-starred night. The vicinity of the church had been cordoned off that afternoon. There was a hefty police presence, with a slew of police vehicles parked around the church grounds and arranged to block the main road. Many of the officers were engaged in corralling the growing crowd of onlookers, gathered in chattering groups strung out along the fluttering lines of crime scene tape that marked the perimeter. Armed police stood guard within the boundaries of the restricted zone, their eyes roving the crowd. The church's front facade was illuminated by a bank of spotlights, and I could make out a miscellaneous glut of vehicles parked along the church's arc of driveway, beyond the wrought iron gates. Overhead, the rapid thud of rotor blades beat the air, the police helicopter circling in a broad arc, patiently observing the activity below. We were let into the cordoned area by plainclothes policemen, at a quiet spot towards the rear of the church, away from the thick of the crowd and from the press, who were in evidence at the front, jostling with the rest, cameras at the ready, anxious for the big scoop.
"Seth, this is Major Stewart. He's in charge of our little party this evening."
Kane smiled reassuringly.
"Ah, Bellamy, glad you could make it,"
said the Major. He spoke in a parade ground bark that marked him out as a man accustomed to command. He was well past middle-aged and balding, but compact and athletic, and he regarded me with steely resolve.
"Your friend's been up to no good."
He smiled wolfishly.
"Glad you're here. I'll assume you know nothing. Let me put you in the picture."
The Major went on to outline the events of the previous week. As far as they knew, the pizza delivery rider had been the first, having been reported missing last Saturday by the owner of the takeaway he worked for, the day after his disappearance. The church had been his last known location, and the moped he'd ridden had later been found parked outside. The postman had been next, on the Monday morning. Mr. Jones's parents were also missing and believed to be inside the church, their Mercedes being among the vehicles crammed on the church driveway. Some youths were reported entering the property on the Wednesday night by a concerned local resident. They had not been seen since. On Thursday, a pair of officers entered the premises as part of their investigations. They too remain unaccounted for. Since then, 3 separate teams had entered the church, and none had returned.
"There's clearly still activity in there," Stewart asserted. "Lights are in evidence, as you can see, and music. We cut the power to the place this morning, but your friend must have installed a backup generator."
So what the hell do you want me to do?" I inquired, somewhat rashly. Stewart cast an appraising eye over me.
"We think he's holding them hostage,"
he barked. Kane smiled. "We were rather hoping a familiar face might swing things in our favour. Perhaps you might be able to talk some sense into him." "Hostage?" I stammered. No, that's not Xander's style. He's a loner. He hates company. I can't see him taking a bunch of hostages, not his parents." "No, that explanation, it doesn't make sense. Has he made any demands? What could he possibly have to gain?" I paused to consider. "Have you thought about... what about a gas leak? Carbon monoxide poisoning? That could be it. That could be the cause of all this." Kane shook his head. We've tested for that. The results came back negative. It's clean. There's no gas leak of any kind.
A disease then? Something contagious, I said, groping in the dark for some kind of logical explanation. Something virulent enough to incapacitate an SAS crisis team in a matter of minutes? Unlikely.
Stuart smiled reprovingly, his eyes steady. I held my palms up, blinking. So you're telling me you've lost an SAS team in there, and now you want me to go in? Are you blokes fucking crazy or what? I was exasperated. The whole thing seemed farcical, and it crossed my mind, at that point, that this might all be some kind of elaborate prank. He's your friend, Mr. Bellamy. We're somewhat out of options here, said Kane gravely. We were really rather counting on your help. Agitated and confused, I dragged my fingers through my hair, lost in worried conjecture. I thought of my wife alone at home, concerned and ignorant of my plight. I thought of my old friend, of us as boys together at school all those years ago, of the friendship we'd shared, remembering the lessons he taught me, about aspiration, about daring to dream, about transcending your own inhibitions, about making your own mark on history. I thought of him now, speculating on the hermetic existence he'd chosen. What had his aloof isolation done to him? How had it affected his mind, his perceptions? Had it twisted him, rendering him capable of something truly dark? I didn't know what waited for us inside that austere edifice, but I knew my old friend was in there, and that the connection that had been made between us as boys so many years ago, though attenuated by time and separation, still remained, that it still meant something, and I knew that if I could, I would help him. I'll be accompanying you myself, if that's any comfort, Kane confided, his encouraging smile wilting under the pressure of my silent, withering stare. Fine, I said in the end. My voice was quavering now with nervous tension at the prospect of what might be ahead. I'll have a look and see if there's anything I can accomplish. But if there's any sign of anything out of the ordinary, I'm leaving. Understood? Understood, snarled Kane. Good man. They fitted me out with a bulletproof vest for some reason. I can only assume that their hope was its presence might imbue me with some modicum of confidence. I can't imagine they thought it would make any real difference. It didn't. After a short briefing, Kane and I set off, cutting through the open gates of the churchyard and, skirting around the abandoned cars, we approached the main door. Behind us I heard the murmur of the massed crowd rise in anticipation of our approach, its drawl punctuated by the intermittent staccato click of press cameras. Overhead sounded the rapid thud of the police helicopter as it circled, relentless in its vigil, a great mechanical vulture biding its time, patient and alert, awaiting fresh carrion. Kane led the way, slipping into the body of the church through the open door, and I followed him, my heart pounding in my throat in blind anticipation of I knew not what. Within, we were met by a curious sight. At first glance, under the dimly flickering blue glare, they looked like so many discarded shop mannequins, all crammed together. A crowd of static figures filling the vacant vastness of the nave, each of them paralysed in place, like a fleeting snapshot of a concert crowd frozen in a single instant, their rapt and wavering attention fixated on the stage. Seen distantly at first, but with growing delineation as we advanced, the curious movements of the capering figures on the screen were particularly fascinating and absorbing, their ever-evolving choreography mesmerising me as I moved through the hypnotised crowd in a deepening trance. The air around us rippled invisibly to a complex broken beat whose intricate syncopation evolved from moment to moment, like an acoustic manifestation of the Mandelbrot set. Overlaying this was an enigmatic chord progression that touched my heart in a manner almost overwhelming. A rising euphoria overcame me on the instant, yet at the same moment I found myself sucked down into a deep, soul-rending melancholia. I succumbed to the zenith of joy blended with the nadir of despair all at once. Before we'd had a moment to gain our bearings, we were crying, both of us enveloped in an ocean of pure joy intermingled and inextricably intertwined with a soul-rending, existential pain. It was almost unbearable. It was heaven and hell combined. Through a haze of emotional devastation, I was yet dimly aware of those around me. Leaving the hypnotised Kane behind, lost in the crowd, I drifted through their midst toward the front. Soldiers and policemen were there, some local teenagers, an old lady in a headscarf, and a traffic warden were among the stagnant congregation, mutely worshipping that eerie electronic altar. Nearing the front, I passed an older couple, who I vaguely recognised as Xander's parents, their gleaming eyes transfixed on the screen just like all the rest. The postman was there too, gaunt and pale at the front, and the pizza delivery man, dusty and emaciated now after a full week locked in his syncopic paralysis. Sat in the high-backed leather chair at the head of the crowd was Xander, or rather, what remained of him. He was a withered husk, his ill-fitting clothes hanging loosely over a fragile scaffold of bones. His expression was emotionless, just dry, papery skin, stretched taut over the naked skull. But the eyes were alive and glistening, their glossy surface reflecting in miniature the gliding antics of the actors on the screen. Half hypnotised, I followed his gaze, and the world around me melted into insignificance. I was lost, irresistibly compelled by the intriguing scenes unfolding on the screen. Buoyed up and entranced, my soul carried away by the heart-rending beauty and terror of the music, by its primordial, omnipotent orchestration. I wandered in a dream. An ermine-edged cloak fluttered at my heels in the buffeting wind. From the high marble battlements of my castle, I observed my kingdom. Beyond the walls of the city spread a vast and verdant valley of forests and fields, rimmed at the horizon by a ragged range of snow-capped peaks. Beyond, the great hull of a green planet hung static in the cloud-streaked turquoise sky, its surface minutely checkered with an intricate patchwork of fields and forests and folded mountain ranges. She took my hand then, the one I'd wanted but had never known. She was beautiful and austere, but her eyes were alight with a desperate yearning love that dissolved the last shred of reticence lingering in the pit of my soul, and we kissed. I awoke to the stark terror of a howling silence. Shivering and alone in the blackness, I collapsed to the cold stone floor. I was weak, terribly weak, weighed down by the burden of the bulletproof vest I wore. There was a terrible, inexorable throbbing agony in my skull, my acid-drenched eyes burning, and as arid as my mouth. It was dry, bone-dry, my tongue like a ragged sheet of sandpaper, every cell in my body desiccated beyond salvation. I knew I was dying. I shrugged off the vest and struggled to stand, feeling something give at my wrist as it bore my weight, one of the bones in the forearm, I think. There was no pain, just a dull sense of inevitability, a harrowing emptiness of care. I inched through the silent throng, the last living survivor of that terracotta army, my mind a blank, save for a dim flicker of curiosity that drove me on. Outside it was silent as the grave, the thrum of London traffic was gone. No hum of life remained, even the birdsong had disappeared. There were bodies here and there out on the main road, and 100 yards away down the street, I could make out the twisted wreckage of the police helicopter, its shattered hull intersecting a ruined section of Edwardian terrace. I staggered out among the dusty cars, a grey shade, unquiet and abroad in an alien shadow world. There was a woman standing among the dead, at the perimeter the police had erected, the only living thing in all the sprawl of London for all I knew. I gravitated toward her, almost inevitably. She paid me no mind, her attention rapt by something cupped lovingly in her withered palm. Pausing at her shoulder, I glanced at the narrow screen secreted there. Tiny figures danced and shifted in mesmerizing convolutions on the glossy surface. The hypnotic strains of the music emanating from the phone's tiny speaker gripped me abruptly, the complexity of its evolving cadence, the euphoria and tragedy of its vaulting chorus. It was ecstasy and pain all at once. It was heaven and it was hell combined. I gazed out from the high battlements of my castle. Beyond the walls of the city lay the verdant valley. At the far horizon, the broad arc of the green planet grazed the snow-capped peaks of a nameless mountain range.
You have been listening to Hooked, episode 23 of Savage Bites. Written, illustrated, narrated and produced by Christian Bravery. If you enjoyed this original story, then please subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you'll know when I upload the next one. And please share the link with anyone you know who's interested in horror or creepypasta, anyone who might be interested in listening to these stories. If you want to show your appreciation, maybe leave a comment or hit the like button. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll see you in the next one.